Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, as we discussed, resistance hero John Bolton stunned everyone by just coming right out, saying the whole quiet part out loud, admitting in an interview, bragging even to Jake Tapper on CNN about his vast experience planning coups.
With all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but, other places, it takes a lot of work. And that's not what he did.
Wow. Bolton there, who served in not only the Trump administration, but also the supposedly respectable Bush administration, broke an unspoken rule of Washington decorum. This whole exchange got me thinking about which crimes and outrages are considered acceptable, even noble sometimes in Washington, and which are considered monstrous, out of bounds. Bolton is a perfect case in point here. Now, we all know that our government relatively routinely, especially during the Cold War, but still today, foments, supports, and outright plots and directs coups. We busy ourselves subverting democracy wherever we please to install regimes that our elites believe will better support American interests, read capital's interest. Now, we're all supposed to know this, but just not say anything about it. Notorious neocon, as we covered earlier, David Frum, was deeply aggrieved by Bolton's loose lips, tweeting, "Former U.S. National Security advisors should measure their words and avoid cynical jokes that give aid and comfort to those who do not wish this country well." You might note that the problem for Frum was not the coups. It was Bolton's breach of Washington decorum in talking about the coups so casually and so publicly. And it's not only overseas coups that can be tolerated or even celebrated if handled with the proper DC etiquette. Just think about 2000. Instead of ruffians in Viking hats waving Confederate flags, you had Harvard lawyers partnering with politicians clearly branded with the imprimatur of the establishment. George W. Bush and his brother, who was governor of Florida, and their team of highly paid, highly educated, respectable lawyers, they executed a highbrow coup in coordination with the conservative partisans on the Supreme Court. So instead of Rudy Giuliani, you had Ted Olson, former Reagan Assistant Attorney General. And not only did Washington accept this coup, the fact that Al Gore bowed out quickly with barely a protest is lauded to this day as a triumph of democracy, when in fact, of course, it was the polar opposite, an outright shredding of the people's will, far more effective than what happened in 2020, but we were uniformly assured that the institutions held in our democracy prevailed. George W. Bush, he maintained his decorum, most important of all the DC rules. Not once did we hear of smeared ketchup on the White House walls during his tenure, so he was allowed to serve 2 terms after stealing the election, leading our nation to the most grievous foreign policy mistakes of a generation, teeing up the housing collapse, and greenlighting mass surveillance against our own people and mass human rights abuses against others. But we were allowed the illusion that our country was more or less functioning. The lie that this coup was actually the glory of democracy in action saved us from having to actually face the rotten core of the American project today. Was our ignorance actually bliss? Now, I know the liberal instinct is to paint Trump as a singular evil who came out of nowhere to defile the pure and innocent grand old party. But of course, the truth is, he just painted all of the pre-existing failures of our nation, especially its political elite, in garish colors, robbing us of our ability to maintain that blissful ignorance. DC was never mad about the corruption, the assault on democracy, the grifting, the lies, the contempt for governance. They were always most upset that he did not follow the Washington rules when engaging in all of those behaviors. I mean, Washington has long operated on an elaborate scheme of institutionalized corruption, a favor there, a campaign contribution here, a board seat for a kid or relative or post-public service gig. Trump literally expected people to pony up cash at his properties that would go directly in his pocket in order to get in his good graces. It was all up front. All political fundraising, of course, is shady, manipulative, playing on emotions, promising results they know they will never achieve. Trump literally raised millions for a fund to fight election fraud that did not even exist. Now, in the neoliberal era, presidential administrations are incompetently managed by unserious people, stacked with some of the wrongest people on the entire planet. Neoliberals don't really believe in government, so kind of makes sense. And the collective brilliance of the experts they employ has led us into disastrous wars, criminal trade deals, and financial collapses. But these experts, they were pedigreed. And so we were assured we were actually in good hands, and we were just too dumb and uneducated to really understand what was going on here. Trump, on the other hand, he went ahead and put Rick Perry in a role as Energy Secretary that was previously held by a nuclear physicist. Rick Perry.
The third agency of government, I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see, I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry. Oops.
The agency he forgot that was literally the very agency that he was ultimately put in charge of. Now, the rejection of this brazen bad behavior and preference for decorous bad behavior is driving the Ron DeSantis chatter right now. That's why DeSantis' support is overwhelmingly college-educated versus the more downscale base overwhelmingly sticking with Trump. DeSantis has done enough in the Trump era to hug the former president, be a little Trumpy, but he's a version of Trumpism that GOP elites think that they could potentially live with. He's being pitched as a sort of highbrow Trump. He won't call Stormy Daniels horseface. He won't watch with delight as rioters proclaim their desire to murder his vice president. He won't put Rick Perry in charge of the Energy Department. If Ron DeSantis does a coup, it will be the George W. Bush-style coup. He's walked out respectability on Stop the Steal, refusing to say whether or not he thinks the 2020 election was stolen, but not going all the way down the conspiracy rabbit hole. And another Trump-like display of contempt for democracy also overrode the will of Florida residents who voted to reinstate voting rights for felons. Now, elite DeSantis backers are not opposed to coups per se. They just want it to be done in the Washington way, so they don't have to answer so many uncomfortable questions about it or be embarrassed by the unwashed masses who show up to execute it. They aren't opposed to corruption per se. They just want it executed through the accepted channels of kickbacks and campaign contributions. Maybe with DeSantis, they posit, we could recloak the ugliness of Washington in enough Washington respectability that we could go back to pretending that the country is more or less functional. The decorum slathered like a cheap coat of paint over underlying rot that continues to fester. Masking it enough for Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Mitt Romney to feel comfortable once again. And who knows? Maybe that useful fiction would be enough to keep our country from going off the deep end. After all, nations and institutions are built more on faith, collective storytelling, and shared delusions than they are really on anything tangible. Or maybe now that Trump has taken our every failing and put it on vibrant and repulsive display, maybe we can't really unsee it. Now, Trump was always hailed as a truth teller by his fans, which was a little bit perplexing given that he just makes up shit all the time whenever he wants to. But when it came to Washington, as John Bolton did in that extraordinary moment with Jake Tapper, Trump always said the quiet part out loud. And maybe that is what his people meant. I mean, if your only choices are a John Bolton who keeps quiet about his coups or one that proudly broadcasts them to the world, which is actually better? Does it really matter in the end? Trump took all of the accepted criminal, immoral, repulsive, authoritarian behavior of Washington elites and he turned it up to 11, didn't he? And if the Republican base wanted the highbrow version of Trump, well, they could have picked Chris Christie or Ted Cruz long ago. John Bolton really got me thinking here, Sagar, about cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.